Hello everyone, welcome back to Foot Forecast. In today's video, I'm going to be discussing the appointment of Roberto De Zerbi, and there's some different segments I'm going to discuss in this video. The first one is discussing why did De Zerbi take the contract. The second is the positive and negatives of the appointment. And finally, how would Spurs set up under Roberto De Zerbi, and do I think they will stay up? But the first thing I want to discuss is the sacking of Igor Tudor. And at the end of the day, I feel like this is probably the right decision, because I felt like with Tudor, they were just walking towards a relegation, were Spurs, and potentially a different manager has a better chance of getting them out of this mess. And this comes down to the fact that Spurs had no wins in the league, and Igor Tudor was making some strange decisions, playing players out of position. And also, I'm not sure if Tudor's in some of the right mindset to continue as Spurs manager after the sad passing of his father. So now we're on to discussing why has De Zerbi taken this job. And I think the obvious reason why is the contract offer. It looks like he's going to get a really good deal. Is Roberto De Zerbi, potentially a 5-year contract, and you expect the wage that he's going to get is going to be really good. So it's sort of a no-brainer from a financial perspective for Roberto De Zerbi. As well as this, I just don't think it really matters if he does take Spurs down. I don't think he's going to be blamed. Thomas Frank, Igor Tudor, and more importantly, sort of the higher-ups in Spurs are going to be blamed for this, not Roberto De Zerbi. And also, I actually think he wants to take this job in the summer, but he obviously wouldn't take the job if they're in the Championship. So he's probably attempting to actually save Spurs, so he's able to actually take the job in the summer. As well as this, he's going to have a break clause if they do go down, so he can leave without sort of having to worry about the contract that he's under. And as well as this, he'll also probably get a massive bonus if Spurs stay up, as he should get. So let's now talk about the positives and the negatives of the appointment. Starting off with the positives, I think he's a better manager, in my opinion, than a Thomas Frank or an Igor Tudor. I think that's proven by the fact he did a better job with the jobs he's had. For example, at Brighton, I thought he did a good job, and I also think he did a decent job with Marseille despite leaving them. He also brings an attacking style of football, and his sort of sides create a lot of chances, which I think suits the squad more than the alternative appointment of a Sean Dyche, where it's more about defending. And look, maybe that's more what you want for a relegation battle, but I don't think these players are set up to defend like a Nottingham Forest, like a Leeds, like a West Ham. It's just not the DNA of these players, and they're actually better off having a proper go. So I don't mind it in that way. And also, if you look at that defence, Mickey van der Ven, Christian Romero, I actually think they're better defenders where they're sort of higher up the pitch than sort of sitting in and looking to defend in that way. And also, I think he's a more inspiring appointment than a Sean Dyche, someone the fans can definitely get behind with the sort of style of football, and the players, because I think they'll enjoy playing under De Zerbi more than an Igor Tudor, which I think is actually important, because right now those Spurs players just don't want to be there, playing with no confidence. And maybe if you start playing some decent football, they'll be more encouraged, and they may want to actually give it a bit more of a fight. I also just can't see those players wanting to play under a Sean Dyche, and I think that could be a real issue as Dyche getting that buy-in, because I just don't think he would get that. I think he's more likely to succeed actually at a Leeds, a West Ham, or even a Forest, despite being sacked there earlier in the season. And I also think for the Spurs players, it's actually better for them to have more of a long-term manager who's going to be there for potentially more than just the end of the season, like an Igor Tudor, because it may mean that the Spurs players decide to give a bit more fight, knowing he's more than just an interim manager. But what are the negatives of the appointment of Roberto De Zerbi? Because I think there are quite a few. First of all, he's a very fiery character, is Roberto De Zerbi, and he divides opinions hugely, and he has the ability to make the situation a lot worse and completely blow it up, which I think is a real concern for Spurs. And especially in the media in the past, where you can see he makes very aggressive comments. He's done this recently at Marseille, and that's not what Spurs need in this situation. They don't need another Conte. They need a manager that's going to support those players and help the players. I personally don't see Roberto De Zerbi really doing this, putting sort of an arm around the shoulder. like another manager would potentially do. In fact, I would say Roberto De Zerbi would do the exact opposite. The other concern is, despite De Zerbi previously managing in the Premier League, he's never sort of experienced a relegation battle, so he doesn't have the experience of a Sean Dyche or like a Nuno or even a Daniel Farke who's previously gone down. So this could be a problem in terms of Spurs being too naive, as the style of football probably won't really suit a side in a relegation battle, and they could have got a more proven manager. But as I've already said, I don't think those sort of managers actually suit that Spurs squad. I don't think there's any point in appointing a manager like a Sean Dyche. I don't think it would have worked. But in saying this, I think you still want your manager to be pragmatic at times, which I'm just not convinced De Zerbi is. And the other problem is that De Zerbi just doesn't have the time to implement the style that he wants. And I can see them conceding a lot of needless goals in this relegation battle, which Spurs really don't need. So then finally, what is my final verdict on the De Zerbi appointment? It's very risky. There's no doubt about this. There's going to be a high pressing system you would expect with a very attacking system. And look, it could pay off and Spurs could get out of the relegation zone, but it could also turn into absolute disaster and Spurs really struggle. They're too naive and it just doesn't work in these sort of crucial games. But I think it is more likely to work than sort of keeping Igor Tudor or going with a Sean Dyche type manager. So at least I think they've got that right. But I don't think it's the ideal appointment. But at this point, I don't know what is the ideal appointment for Spurs. And my gut feeling says that I think Spurs still go down, because I only think they pick up about 7 points. And I think the teams around them potentially pick up more than 7 points. So now I'm going to discuss some possible lineups and what I expect from a Roberto De Zerbi side. So as I was saying, it's going to be a very attacking style of football and it's going to be a high pressing system. And don't get too worried, Spurs fans, about this potential lineup that I'm showing you on the screen. I don't expect this to be the De Zerbi lineup, but this is an option for him. He has previously used a 3 at the back at Marseille in his last job. And in terms of this lineup, it's not bad despite it being a 3 at the back. The goalkeeper won't change, and that is Vicario. Then the 2 wing-backs are Porro and Udogie. Then a back 3 of Kevin Danso, Romero and Van de Ven. Then the midfield 2, this is interesting. You've got some different options, I think, for this midfield 2. You could go with the likes of Bentancur and Sarr, but I think you go Bergvall and Gray. Those are 2 players I expect to fight for De Zerbi. Left 10, I'd go Xavi Simons. Right 10, I'd go Kudus, who should be coming back. And up front, I'm going Richarlison over Dominic Solanke. And why? I expect Richarlison to work hard and fight and press high, which I think is important for the system. And I think he's the sort of player that's useful in a relegation battle. If he was to use the system, which I wouldn't, what sort of players would thrive? Well, I think the wing-backs of Udogie and Porro would. I think keeping Udogie fit is going to be key either way, whatever system it is for the rest of the season. I think Simons would play really well as a left 10 as well. I think this would be a very good position for him. But overall, I think Spurs are better off using a different system than this. So then here is the lineup I expect them to use, and it is a 4-2-3-1. The one change is that Mathys Tel comes in for Kevin Danso, and this will be a pretty attacking side you expect. Simons also goes into the central 10 and Kudus moves out wide. I think this makes more sense for sort of the overall Spurs squad. And I think this is a lineup that can get the best out of a lot of these players. What I would say is I'd actually consider playing Jed Spence over Porro if you're playing a back 4, because I don't think Porro is good enough defensively. So that's maybe a change I would make if it was a back 4. Obviously, Mathys Tel out wide isn't ideal, but Spurs don't really have any other options right now for that winger position as far as I'm aware. So overall, after looking at the lineup, Spurs' lineup has got enough to stay up. I think there's enough quality in that side to stay in the division. But the problem for Roberto De Zerbi will be buy-in. He needs these players to buy into his style and also show some fight. If you can get that fight out of Spurs and that buy-in, then they probably will stay up. But I'm just not convinced that it's going to happen. And I do worry about De Zerbi's character. And I feel like it could turn into a whole lot of shit, or it may turn out great. I think it's this sort of appointment where we sort of don't know. And I think either way, whoever the manager was, it was going to be very difficult to turn this side around. Let me know your thoughts on the appointment of De Zerbi. Do you think it's a good appointment? Do you think he keeps Spurs in the division? If not, or even if you do think he does, what would have been a better appointment than Roberto De Zerbi potentially? And would have you preferred someone like a Sean Dyche, or even maybe a Spurs club legend like a Harry Redknapp, which has been talked about quite a lot, even a Ryan Mason? And if you enjoy this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel as well as liking the video.